Welcome to the AI Adoption Podcast. I'm your host, Professor Ashley Braganza. And in this episode, I'm very pleased to welcome Kulveer Ranger, the Lord Ranger of Northwood. Kulveer has extensive experience in the IT industry, and before becoming a peer, worked on the London Transport Oyster card system. And in this fascinating episode, Kulveer reminds us of the importance of looking backwards and learning from previous waves of technology to really understand and get under the skin of AI adoption going forward. He talks about some of the opportunities that these technologies offer, and in particular, the importance of understanding and redesigning and fundamentally challenging the business models that organizations currently have and the impact of AI on current business models. Kulveer, welcome to the AI Adoption Podcast. I really appreciate you taking the time out to come to speak to me and my listeners on this episode. Before we kind of get into the detail, it would be great if you could just share a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you came to have an interest in this area of AI.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. And look, really pleased to join you on what's becoming a seminal podcast that you've established. So great to be a guest. And look, it's a big question when you ask someone, how did you get involved in artificial intelligence? You got to sort of unpick the seeds of your career to sort of work out, how did this happen? How did I get to this point? But let me start by saying, look, I've been really privileged to have a career which accidentally started in that thing called IT, information technology, way back when, 25, 30 years ago, when we were sort of the first generation of people who'd had home computers. I remember having a Commodore 64. Some people had a ZX Spectrum. These things called the BBC, not the British Broadcasting Corporation, but computers of that were used, very basic computers at school. I think they probably had less power than your average digital watch, or even less than that nowadays. But these things sort of started computing in the background in the sort of 80s, but computing had been developed in the 60s and 70s. But in the 80s and 90s, it really came to the fore in terms of where industry started to adopt computing. And not just computing, because actually, forgive me, Ashley, but I'm not a tech geek. I've never really been. I got that first computer. I did write a line of code that's sort of in my Commodore 64, but after that, I don't think I've ever really been a coder. But what I have been is someone who has enjoyed the development of outcomes from computing, the power of computers and software to help us develop programs. And the emergence of Microsoft, the emergence of Word, the emergence of things like the internet, that just helped shape how we did things, and dramatically so, I have to say, through the 90s, the noughties and onwards. And through my career, which we can get into a little bit, but I was fortunate that I kept weaving into technology, but not as an engineer, more as a technologist who's looking at strategically what it is that we can do with this technology, but even more so, Ashley, how do we explain this technology? Because when you really want something to work, it's not about having a great idea. That's sort of 50% of the job. It's explaining it to someone else so they will feel that they can own it and, let's say, adopt it and be part of it. So through my career, I was very fortunate. I began a career in management consultancy, worked in transport mainly, but transport was adopting technology en masse. A big example of that was the Oyster card program. I had 3 years on that program, enjoyed it immensely, and we managed to deliver something that was game-changing and seminal in terms of contactless technology. But the point was, it was tech. It was a huge technology program. And then I started to realize that this symbiotic relationship for me at that point between technology and transport, but actually technology and everything, was occurring. And in my time at City Hall, where I worked for Boris Johnson as his transport advisor, I also realized there that technology in a different format was evolving, and we were getting startups and a new kind of businessy ecosystem environment that was happening in East London at that point. So I convinced the mayor at that point that we should set up the digital office for London, which we did. And that started leveraging things like data, the London data store, and encouraging those kinds of entrepreneurial businesses, but also the big macro businesses, the global businesses, even then, the Googles and others of that time, to come and invest in London. And then I went back into industry for another 10 years after leaving City Hall in 2012, and really wanted to see how could I help at this sort of interface between private sector, industry, and the emerging innovation that was coming through, because you needed people, I felt, who could look both ways. The challenge was, how do we understand what the customer, be that the public sector, or how did the private sector and the industry come together to talk the same language? You needed people who could look both ways, who could understand what a customer's outcome requirements were, but also could understand, not necessarily be the technologist, but actually understand what the engineers, the software engineers, the developers were talking about.
Yeah.
And I felt that that was sort of a role I could play. That's what I'd been playing unintentionally through my career, and then more intentionally in the last 10 years when I joined a global technology business called Atos, and they had invested heavily in things like quantum computing, cybersecurity, cloud. And actually, around 2016, 17, we were looking at automation and where that was going, but that was evolving into where we would talk about artificial intelligence. And in fact, we set up our first AI labs in partnership with Google Cloud in 2018. And from that point onwards, you could see that AI was going to be a fundamental part of the sort of ecosystem around technology. And now, as I am in the House of Lords, I look to leverage my career, my experience in the discussions we have both now and definitely will have in the future around this topic.
It's interesting you mention 2018, because that for me is a very important year, because that's the year I set up the Center for AI at Brunel, because I could see that this technology was definitely coming through and was going to have a big impact on organizations. Kulveer, thank you for that really solid introduction, and in some ways reminding us that AI is a technology that's been built upon layer and layer, multiple layers of previous versions of technologies that organizations have had to absorb. Um, from your perspective, what lessons do you think can be learned from those previous waves of companies implementing technology that you feel might carry through to this next wave of AI?
It's a really good question, Ashley, because I think people right now are so fixated, and not a moment can go by in the average person's day where they won't hear the term AI, whether it's in the media, whether it's work, whether it's with your family and friends, whatever it may be. It's permeating through everything, and quite rightly so, because it is something that's really transforming the world around us. But what does that mean? What does that transforming mean? And we've been through this a few times in our lifetimes, in our career, because I look back and it does take, you get to a point in life where you've got a lot of time to look back on, and hopefully some more time to look forward to as well. But I look back at things like the emergence of the mobile phones, and then that evolving to smartphones. I look at the emergence of the internet and that evolving to the web, and what happened in terms of businesses and retail, but also blogs, and how this World Wide Web suddenly turned into a marketplace, turned into a networking place, turned into a platform for us to all to use. Even before that, I look at the emergence of email. We didn't have email wasn't around when I was at university, dare I say. But these massive shifts, yes, in technology, but actually in adoption of the technology and how we then decided to use it, and the impact they've had both on actual business change but cultural change, have been phenomenal. And I think we have to look at AI as one of those shifts. I think people are slightly, quite rightly getting fixated about AI, but let's put it into the context of some of those shifts, those technological shifts, those cultural shifts, those societal shifts that have happened, where we've adapted adopted and learned and then utilized to get benefit from these technologies. So I think there's a lot happening around the conversation about AI. But what we need to learn is from those seismic shifts, what worked? What were we concerned about when those things happened, and what actually materialized, and what didn't we understand, and how can we be a bit more comfortable each time these technological shifts happen? Don't get me wrong, AI is a huge technological shift. Is it bigger than the internet? Debate to be had for a lot of academics, but it's big because it's leveraging a lot of other technologies. Not AI is just not doing it itself. It's leveraging, the Internet of Things. It's leveraging big data. It's leveraging cyber. It's leveraging cloud, and actually making those different technologies even more useful because it acts like the glue I find between these things. And I think we're going to have a moment where people have to now look at it in a way that says, yes, there are some challenges, but when we looked at adoption, what worked? Because actually it comes down to the age old, and I know you as a professor in this area will smile when I say this. It comes back down to change management, right? God bless that phrase, because it's if you've been to a business school in the last 30 or even 40 years, change management was the thing that was underpinning a lot of what you will be learning about, whether it be cultural change, whether it be operational change, business change, strategic change management. So when something disruptive comes in, how do you respond and react to that change? And business schools are littered with case studies of businesses that did well in adopting the wave of change and those who missed the wave and got completely lost. So that I come back to it and say it's change management, and let's look at that.
And look, you're talking to this is music to my ears, because you're talking to the professor of organizational transformation. So change management and AI, I mean, for me, they go hand in glove. What would you say are the major lessons that organizations should be learning then? What would you say are some specific things that would carry over?
Well, look, firstly, I know people get very concerned or interested in the actual technology, and I think that's quite right. You have to have what we would call, technological due diligence, your tech audit about what is it you're actually buying. But let's be honest, Ashley, people have been buying software since software was started to being produced. When we first bought first bought our operating systems, I hate to keep plugging Microsoft, but I can remember spending donkey's years loading Microsoft DOS or whatever platform, Windows 11, onto a PC through a CD. We buy software. We bought Sage, or we bought Oracle, we bought, data data housing, whatever software it is, we buy these things. Did we all understand how that technology worked when we bought it? You'd had back then an IT department that may have bought it for you and then provided a service to the rest of the business. So a lot of people are, inverted commas, buying or developing their AI platforms. And the question is, how much do we all need to understand every element of it? Now, there's a lot more influence. We have to be clear, the conversations about ethical data, how is there bias in the system? If there is, how do we understand that? How do we understand how it works? These are all actually part of that learning mechanism that we have to go through. We're at the early stage of that learning curve with AI. It will get better. We will improve it. It will be something that evolves over time. But
I mean, yeah, sorry.
The adoption point
Yes.
is, how do you work out what it's going to do for your business or your organization or for your people? What are those outcomes? And I think what we have to do is you have to have, dare I say again, the IT department, the technology side of things, but you have to have those people who are also going to be the business change leaders for AI, that are going to understand which outcomes you want to drive through your business. So a lot of people talk about productivity change.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what does that mean? Well, maybe there are certain roles that are going to change in how they operate because they're going to leverage the technology to do certain activities. That'll mean that those roles or those people can do something else. How do you map that? How do you actually capture that productivity improvement? How do you utilize that in a beneficial way? How do you decide that your business, and fundamental, and I say this to you, actually, you get smart, the redefining of your operating model is critical. Do you understand what your operating model currently is? Do you understand what AI is going to do to it? Do you understand how you're going to capture the benefits of it? And do you understand what your new operating model is going to look like? That is the really robust part of I think, the industrial challenge of utilizing and capturing the benefits from AI. I know people are fixated about other elements of the AI conversation, but the operational redesign and understanding what benefits can be derived by that, I think, is crucial to success for a business.
And increasingly now, when you start and talking about that operating model, then that could bring about some very fundamental changes, because the operating model is it's the framework that holds the whole organization together. It brings the strategy together with the culture, with the day-to-day activities, the products, the services that we offer. I mean, it is the all-encompassing framework, that operating model. And if you then, for instance, take the culture of the organization, how would you how do you think the AI and the changes to the operating model will impact on an organization's culture, for instance?
Immensely, Ashley, immensely. But again, I think we just start putting AI slightly to the side here, because this has changed. Now, we've seen digital transformation happening across industries for the last 20 odd years, if not more. Now, I always think of the music industry. It used to sell records, it then sold tapes, it then sold CDs. It then sort of thought, oh no, what's Napster? If people can remember that, when suddenly streaming or, networked computers allowed music to be available to anyone anywhere for free. But that was digital transformation happening to an industry en masse suddenly, and it had to transform and evolve. It's kind of like the Kodak moment where, Kodak had developed the digital camera, but didn't move forward with it. And then suddenly everyone else has moved to digital and Kodak's still producing film. So it's an operating model, but it's also a strategic change for your business, because when you transform, suddenly new opportunities evolve in terms of how you do what you used to do, or actually do you innovate and do something different as well, or completely different. And on that basis, a business has to look at its, yes, operational change, but it's strategic change. And these are big challenges for business leaders. And, those executives and CEOs are thinking about what AI does to their organization, which then filters through, as you say, to cultural change, to change in terms of people's objectives and what their role is in this business and what this business is about.
Yeah.
So I think we have to look at AI as, I know people are looking at it in this first, and I still say we're in this very first initial wave of adoption of a rather, and forgive me for dumbing it down somewhat, but a rather simple change in terms of efficiency. Okay, can I use AI to make my business a little bit more efficient? Does that mean I don't have to do those activities I used to do, and I can, not have to trawl through loads of books or look through loads of data, get it to give me some summaries, etc., etc., etc. Easy to manage my inbox. But actually, the second wave of AI is where people actually transform their business. And then that leads to some really exciting things, which is then the third wave, which is those businesses evolve into completely new businesses.
But one of the things from my experience of working with a large number of organizations is that whilst the technology has significant potential, if I take, look at ERP systems, or if we look at, online systems, there is a huge amount of potential that these systems have. But teams within organizations end up using just a little fraction of the technology, because the culture, and I come back to culture, that very often it's the culture that kind of prevents the organization from fully adopting, fully embracing the technology. And so in some ways, I can see that AI will, at one level, change the business model. But equally, I'm thinking, the existing culture may well fight tooth and nail to keep the status quo, and only make a small use of the technology. Well, go on. What are
No,
your thoughts?
you're absolutely right. And actually, it was ever thus, right? Because that
Yes,
old adage, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Right?
yes,
And what you're describing is that resistance that is there in any organization to change. Even if an organization says, we want change, when do we want it now? When are we going to deliver it? Maybe tomorrow if we feel like, but that's a natural status of businesses, of culture, because when something's operating, there's a level of comfort in understanding that operating model,
yeah,
which people feel comfortable about. And people are, creatures of comfort. We don't like change generally because it's difficult, it's uncertain, it's new, it's kind of, oh no, I'm not going to be doing what I used to do. But also that there's another old adage, the burning platform,
yeah,
because if you don't, there's another competitor around the corner that is, and suddenly that can creep up on you. And then it's about, well, where is your business in relation to that competitor who's doing something
yeah,
completely different now? So I think part of it has to be it's a competitive environment. That competition drives innovation and change. And if it gets into a worse situation, it's actually just staying viable as a business, as an enterprise, if you start losing your position, your market position, your revenue stream. So all of these dynamics operate in terms of corporate landscape. And, someone who spent the best part of the last 25 years in the corporate environment, I look at it very much through why aren't we going to do this? What's the risk of not doing it? Where's the danger? So I've always been someone who's been keen to look strategically, but strategy doesn't mean producing, 100 deck slide, which goes through various strategic models that you've been taught at business schools. Yes, that's all very good. A lot of those look backwards, though. What we have to do is those environments that really succeed are those who either are driven by leadership and culture that is very progressive, very forward looking to the kind of cutting edge, bleeding edge, and I have to name companies like Amazon and Tesla and others. They have a and they'll drive emotions in people when you talk about these businesses that are, even Apple to a certain degree, that have been very forward, progressive looking, redefine models of what existed into new things. Phones as we knew them with keypads on to blocks that didn't have anything. A bookstore that suddenly sold everything in the world and got it to you within, a matter of hours. Cars that ran on petrol to cars that are basically computers and can drive themselves. They redefine the proposition and they do it in a way in change. And you have to have a change culture to make those things happen. So and those are big scale companies. It happens at every scale. You can have, entrepreneurs that drive these things in startups and SMEs. And it's an exciting time because I think there's also a really good opportunity here for younger generations to come up with ideas that maybe some of the older generations will sort of be more hesitant to adopt or progress, and can leverage this emerging technology to turbocharge their ideas without maybe needing all the infrastructure and things that you needed before to get your ideas off the ground. So in one way, I think this is a massive opportunity for businesses of all size and scales, but especially startups, scale-ups. And that's why we're having a boom around the world, right?
yes.
In the sort of startup, scale-up world, because people can see a way of making their amazing, innovative ideas come to life.
And the UK has a strong record of getting companies kind of started up. I mean, if you think of DeepMind, I mean, it started here in the UK. What do you think needs to be done to ensure that startups coming through are actually able to then grow and scale, and fulfill on that promise? Because very often these companies kind of get going, but they either don't find the right investment or the right level of investment, the right level of support. What can be done, Kulveer, from your perspective, again, to ensure that UK-based startups can actually become unicorns?
Yeah, look, it's a great question, but again, actually, I always look back to look forward, and um, I look back at my career. I look back at the sort of at the noughties, at the early 2000s. Actually, in 2000, we were all worried about this thing called Y2K, which was not going to allow our computers to reset. But back then, there was a dot-com boom going on.
Yeah.
And I was involved in a startup then. I was working on a small startup with a guy who had a great idea about a travel site. Now, I have to say, this was before lastminute.com floated, and the great work that my fellow peer, Martha Lane Fox, and others did around that business. But we had that era of dot-com startups. And a lot of people were investing in things that they couldn't work out the value of actually at that point. There was a lot of investment going in and people looking to fund things that no one knew what these business models were going to be about. We fast forward a decade into sort of 2010 and beyond, and there's a lot of lessons that have been learned from that. And then you get another startup world emerging. And this was where I was talking about London and, Silicon Roundabout in East London and Tech City and the startups. And this was about creatives coming together, but leveraging data. Data had become much more available in a certain way. In the early noughties, it wasn't. It was very hard to get data. But a decade later, data was there. And it was about, okay, how could we create something, applications, small environments that leverage data to provide a service? And you could see this happening. And there was a revenue and a business model that started to make more sense. Yeah, but now we're at a very different point. We're at a point where we've learned from these variety of different moments where we've had businesses and bubbles emerging. But this time, these businesses are leveraging data, other technologies, IoT, cyber, all these different elements with AI, and they can produce a product generally, and I'm talking very broad strokes here, and I've seen this with a lot of what I called UK AI natives. Their revenue streams start immediately. They sort of, they can produce a platform and revenues coming straight. So when you're investing in these things, you can see the performance that's going to happen potentially. So that's one thing. It's about, that couple of different waves we've had of this kind of booms. This is a different one if you look at it through what's the business model looking like. So that's the first thing. We've got to get people to look at a business model differently. We've got to also ensure that the right level of investment is coming in. And that's a challenge for the UK because we can see that we have a wonderful ecosystem of startups across the country. And I'm very lucky. I get to speak to a lot of businesses, especially AI businesses, and I see that they're now being inundated as soon as they've got an idea that's sort of working and the business model's evolving. Investment, whether it be through angel investors, VC, other larger funds, the scales, they all come in at different rounds. But we struggle sometimes to unlock investment that maintains these businesses in the UK. And in fact, as a member of the House of Lords Science and Technology Select Committee, we're currently actually undertaking a report to look into how can we help startups and scale-ups develop in the UK, but remain in the UK with funding that will keep them in the UK, whether that's government funding to a certain degree, but more so, where do we get the private sector investment that enables this to happen? Because actually, the honest challenge here actually is a lot of these businesses are being hoovered up by global investors, particularly from the US, which then means that our great innovators, our great brains, produce and develop ideas here, but then actually the commercial scale up of them and the revenue and the rewards that come with that end up in a different geography. And we don't want that. We need some of that to stay sovereign in the UK. But the third element, so the first thing is learn the business model. Second thing is the investment. The third thing that is most critical is the skills pipeline. We must make sure that we are developing the right pipeline of skills. Now, when I say that, people immediately think, yes, we must do more STEM, we must get more computer scientists and et cetera, et cetera. Yes, but everything we've discussed on this podcast so far, we've talked about organizational change, business change. A lot of these are non-technical activities. These are roles, these are people who are going to help businesses evolve. They're going to be change managers. They're going to be people who reshape, who develop. And we need to understand those roles better and bring and develop those skills more so. People who are experienced in their careers are pretty good at these things. They've seen one or two change programs. Keep those people, help those people train younger people, less experienced people, people who haven't been involved. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's a vast amount of roles that are going to be involved in this era of change that the emergence of AI is going to provide to industry. And I think we need to keep that broad perspective on the kind of skills that we need as we go through this wave of change that will happen.
I agree. I think that there is a need not just for the technical skills, but also for all of the what I would refer to as enabling skills, the people that help to enable the organization to make that shift, make that transition to that AI business model. With that in mind, Kulveer, I'm going to ask you a slightly potentially unfair question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What if I took you out of this podcast for a moment and put you into a boardroom and the board turned to you and said, what should our priorities be when adopting AI? How would you respond to that board?
To be honest, it's not that alien a conversation to me. I'm having it quite often. I have to say, look, I'm a person who spent most of my career in industry, and I'm still in industry, and I will remain in industry despite being a peer, because I think you have to have that bridge between the parliamentarian environment and what's happening in the world outside us, because it's so important. So that's what I'm going to try and do going forward. But your question is wholly appropriate. I think from a business perspective, it really is about understanding what is it that's going to change in your business environment and break it down. As I say, the first phase is this kind of early stage where people are they're looking for efficiencies because that's what they can hear AI can do for them. Yeah. And let's understand. But I think you really need to look at this through a short, medium, long-term strategic front and say, okay, if we are looking at optimizing efficiency, what does that enable us to then do? Sure, you can bank 10, 20, 30% of efficiency, but what does that do? Okay, if you're going to say that we're going to bank that, we're going to make some savings, etc., fair enough. But I bet your competitor down the street is probably looking at investing that in something and looking at how they're going to evolve their innovation, their outcomes, their services. So you've got to look at what does that take you? Where does that take you? Then how do you use a technology like AI to evolve your innovation, test the market, all the traditional stuff that the great business schools, and I've been lucky in my lifetime to have been to a few of the business schools, and there's nothing like business school basics that can still be applied to every business, no matter what era we're in. Know your market, look at the innovation. Is your operating model meeting that requirement? What do you need to do if you're going off kilter? Where are your strengths? Where are your weaknesses? What's happening in the external environment that you should be looking to be prepared for or adopt? These are all standard, there's no magic here, I would say, Ashley. But I think the challenge is that people can get overwhelmed by this concept of artificial intelligence just because it has emerged. There's a lot going on around it. There's many conversations. And I think, the best thing people can do is to establish their own strategy about what they want to achieve by adopting AI over a period of time.
Kulveer, thank you for joining us on the AI Adoption podcast today. There's some great insights that you've provided throughout. And I think taking a moment, as you say, to look back and to learn some lessons from the previous waves of technology. And you brought through some excellent examples of how we can learn looking into the future by having a clear and cool-eyed view of the past as well. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Ashley. Thank you.